With the latest episode of Helluva releasing earlier this month, the fanbase has become more divided on the overall plot of the series, as new developments for some of the story elements are being revealed in ways I'd personally hoped they would have tried to avoid. This whole discussion originally tipped off after the initial episode for the second series came out. It raked in a lot of success along with some mixed feedback. The episode hit number 1 on trending for a while and is currently sitting at well over 13 million views. This level of engagement is pretty unheard of due to independent animators being somewhat of a scarcity on YouTube. For the most part it's to be expected, but at the same time it's pretty unfortunate. We obviously have some big ones pop up here and there with big projects, but due to YouTube's change in algorithm to reach a more forward flow of advertisable content, they obviously got axed a long time ago. One of the most notable ones is a channel named FlashGits. They used to do more long-form animation content, but more recently switched up to short-style videos because their previous work was unsustainable and it wasn't pushed to a large enough audience, due to the infrequency of the content. To give a brief recap on my thoughts and opinions on the show so far, I'll walk through some of the basic elements and give a few thoughts on each. Overall, I personally enjoy the series quite a lot and it's kind of hard not to, given how easy each episode is to digest. You can practically jump in at any point and get a pretty good grasp of what's happening. Whether that's a good or bad thing depends on your level of investment into the story, but I feel like it really helps bringing new people into the genre, so I can kind of understand why they take a more simplistic approach to the storytelling aspect, especially with how some people engage with content now. It does make it a lot easier to pick up and watch, given that you only really need to know the basic outline of the story and you can jump in on any episode and feel like you've not really missed anything, which is both a good and bad thing because so far it's not focused on clearly building towards a larger idea and hyperfixating on specific aspects of the show that I don't think have been fleshed out enough. It starts to narrow itself when they start trying to hone in on these certain aspects, and at some points can feel like a bit of a drag. The cast shown so far are all really unique with eye-catching designs, but can at times clash with and blend with some of the more complicated backgrounds. It can be a bit harsh at times, but for the most part it's barely noticeable and is clearly improving rapidly over time. It's a fairly old criticism of the show, but one that I think at least deserved to be mentioned, just to show the progress of how far the show has come. In terms of general story progression so far, it seems to try and base its structure on shows similar to Adventure Time, with a fairly stagnant progression of storyline and having a clear lack of main goal, but follows them on a more short story per episode basis that should be building slowly towards something larger. Where these kinds of shows shine is in the details. Each episode needs to feel like at least has some sort of place within the show. Moving on to the first episode of Season 2, it seems to have been one of the most divisive episodes within the series, with tons of discussions happening on YouTube, Twitter and Reddit about it, multiple different dramas over people arguing and harassing each other about different opinions. It was a bit sad to see from the sidelines having people voice their concerns about the direction of the series, only to be shouted down by an angry mob for seemingly no reason. A few of the most notable criticisms people took note of include Blitz and Stolas, Stella, and the flashbacks. To expand on this further, let's take a look at Blitz and Stolas. The main contention people have is that the overall story and episode has now become too focused on Stolitz, which I unfortunately have to agree with. Don't get me wrong, I don't think this is in any way a bad place to take the story, if it's been set up properly. The first introduction we initially have between these two characters is a recycled joke, and some clear disdain from Blitz, giving the impression that this relationship is transactional. As I said earlier, this storyline wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing if it was clearly set out from the beginning, but it almost feels like it's kind of been forced in that direction after not really laying out any other narrative points beforehand, kind of like a last resort. Forcing the narrative in this direction while neglecting to develop every single other character really feels like a misstep to me. Exploring other characters and their flaws would really solidify this show and create a good ground to build off of. There was a small taste for that with some of the previews for episode 2, but given that it's not been released yet, it's hard to give props, but I'm hopeful it will come out soon and expand the characters further. One of the most notable points was that if you look at the series as a whole, 6 out of the 8 episodes contain a heavy emphasis on Stolitz elements. Starting off season 2 with an episode focused on Stolitz content once again caused this issue to reignite. Vivzie said that season 2 would focus more on character development and backstory, which the episode did. However, it was on the 2 characters who had already had the most backstory and screen time given so far. Since episode 8 finale part 2 was cancelled indefinitely, having the season finale be focused on Stolitz and Blitzo, and then the first episode of the series carrying on from that, just fanned the flames for more people wanting to complain. The finale part 2 was meant to be focused around Loona and Blitzo, providing more character development and giving the series a bit of a breather, since it wasn't going to be focused on Blitzo and Stolas. Since this episode is missing, that context is removed and it just makes it so there are back-to-back episodes focusing on Stolitz while other characters take a back seat and lose a sense of relevance within the show. A side product to this issue is the fact that Stolas and Blitzo knew each other as children, and it makes it into the whole love at first sight trope and doesn't really do a great deal to expand on that further. This kind of erodes the nature of the relationship later on and will probably cause issues with some of the writing in future. Only time will tell. In preparation for season 2, I rewatched season 1, and throughout the whole watch there's a feeling of uncertainty where you can't really grasp what's going on, mostly because it feels like there's only one direction it it can go now towards Stolas and Blitz getting together, but that's pretty much it. There's not really much room to expand upon that. The second criticism, and probably the one people were most vocal about, was that Stella's whole character has been ruined, and to a reasonable extent I agree. Within this episode, she's become more of a one-dimensional villain and lost the ambiguity she once had in the previous season. This point currently isn't a massive issue, however if they continue to keep writing her into this classic villain trope, I fear it'll just leave her character to be pretty lifeless and boring, leaving the show without any meaningful tension for the characters to be built off of and ultimately kneecapping their own show. Another point I saw thrown around quite a lot was that there wasn't very many jokes throughout the episode, and it took more of a serious approach than what we've been typically used to. For what it was trying to portray, I don't really think this is an issue at all. There were bits of humour sprinkled throughout, but I don't think including it would have benefited the show, and it would have just made it more jarring for the viewer, making people feel unsure about what to think while watching. I personally think what they had done was fine. The fourth issue people took notice of was the fact that the end song was just Stolas' background song but with lyrics on top. Instead of being an original piece specifically made for the episode, it left people thinking it was a bit lazy and confused, because they'd obviously heard that song before. I believe it served its purpose but didn't really add anything new, just gave Stella an excuse to show up and be annoying, instead of building up dialogue around the argument. The last main criticism I saw floating around was that the entire episode was just flashbacks. This point honestly isn't a massive issue, but because there wasn't really much extra story to expand upon, it feels like wasted potential, when there are far more interesting areas that could have been explored instead, for example the previous relationship between Veronica and Blitz, or how Imp was initially created. It would have made for a much better starting point, especially after the last episode we saw back in season 1. Moving on to my own personal thoughts about the episode, I feel like regardless of the 7-month wait, this episode would have been perfect if it had just been released around the first few episodes of season 1, instead of the start of season 2. Having it much earlier would have set a better narrative, especially if the story is focusing more on both Blitzo and Stolas. I personally think their relationship started in a good place, and they could have weaved it into the story, slowly building up their dynamic throughout the episodes, instead of ambushing the viewer with everything in major chunks, because it felt like more of an exposition dump rather than actual character building. Another point I was curious about was when Blitzo brings up that his new occupation is killing people. There's been multiple different theories over on the main Reddit about it, but nothing really concrete. The most credible of the few I've found talks about it being related to the Osmodian crystals, and Blitzo just going around killing other imps in hell. It could also be more of a white lie to appear more successful to Stolas, and any of these could be true, but until there's any sort of clarification, it'll probably continue to be discussed within the community. Now that I've mostly covered what's been going on recently, I'd like to take some time to go over some of my thoughts on both of the seasons from a more outside perspective. On release for the Helluva pilot and episodes, it seemed to get quite a lot of heat for various art and animation issues. For me personally, most of my issues with the show so far don't really stem from anything visual, it mostly comes from how the narrative was set up to begin with. I feel like people may have gained the wrong impression from the initial pilot, thinking it would be an episodical sitcom instead of a more grounded progressional story. Throughout the show it feels like at multiple points, the narrative could have come across a lot cleaner if they'd taken the time to think about what direction they wanted to take it in. A really easy example of this is the clear lack of world building within the show. The ideas they have are all very unique and interesting, but there's no real shown differences between each ring, hierarchies, and power structures. It feels almost like it's something that they remember halfway through writing the script, and I want to know how this landscape operates and how it impacts the main cast of characters. There's not much point in bringing it up casually if it provides no impact to the story, instead it's acting as an excuse to change the backdrop and fill a couple lines of dialogue. This is something in particular I'd like to see an improvement upon, because I believe the whole world has a lot of untapped potential that they're letting slip away for seemingly no reason. The way each social class interacts with each other and conflict that builds because of it should take a much heavier-handed approach of show don't tell to really sell these ideas. To wrap it up, my thoughts on the show are overall pretty positive. There are obviously some elements I would have gone back and rewritten or changed with the benefit of hindsight, but other than that, it's really nothing that can really ruin the show. Vivzie and the team clearly care a great deal about this project, and it shows through their continuous effort and dedication, and the fact that it's come so far is nothing short of amazing. That's all I wanted to cover in this video. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.